Good morning, I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche organization with your daily video update for April 7th, 2025. With all the talk going on of the effect of the Trump tariff policy on the world economy, I thought it would be important to take a look at the bigger picture here, because the tariff policy may be triggering certain tendencies that are already there in financial markets. But it's not the cause of the collapse. The cause of the collapse is 50 years of neoliberal economic policy, which favors monetary approach and financialization. And that's what's collapsing. And that's what's being rejected by countries which wish to proceed with an economic development policy and would prefer to have cooperation from the Western powers than an attempt to sabotage their growth. Now, too much of the focus is on what's happening on stock markets. So let's start with a simple point, that Donald Trump has a legitimate goal here to straighten out the mess of international trade and finance. But it's bigger than a trade question. The trade imbalance is built into the post-1971 system, in which the United States was put through a shift from a physical economy to a speculative economy. The shift was away from manufacturing, away from emphasis on advanced technological agriculture, from infrastructure investment, and it was funded by an increasingly degraded credit system, which was oriented toward financial profit and gain rather than building an economy which can add value through increases in productivity. Now, from World War II through the 1960s, we had a productive economy in general. There were some ups and downs, but the idea as a whole was that by increasing productivity, you increase wages. You can have a growth in the middle class. And this enabled the development of what became known as a consumer economy. The goal was not consumerism, the goal was improved productivity. But what started to take over after 1971 was a shift toward monetary theory, monetarism, the triumph of monetarism, and the moves toward a service economy, the so-called tech revolution. And so increasingly we had financialization, the development of financial instruments, which were part of the floating exchange system that came in after the 1971 decision to remove the dollar from a gold reserve standard. And it was driven by speculators, increasingly by speculators, and deregulation of the financial system. Included in that was an attack on sovereignty, sovereign nations determining their own policies. Now, from 1947 to 1995, we had what was called GATT, the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, which was a negotiated process of what would be fair in terms of the tariff system. But on January 1st, 1995, we moved to the World Trade Organization, which was dominated by neoliberal economic policy, a free trade model. And this is what began an acceleration of the outsourcing from the U.S. economy to poorer countries with cheaper labor, and at the same time, the development of global supply chains to replace the good production that was lost. Now, this was dependent on a central banking system with an emphasis on liquidity for monetary policy, but the result was a buildup of debt, and the debt has grown exponentially. So instead of investing, instead of creating credit to upgrade manufacturing, what was done was outsourcing. And that's what globalization has become. We've come to the end of this era, and a change is needed. And this is the change toward LaRouche's conception of physical economy. Now, Trump is right to recognize this, but the problem is not how do you fight for a larger share of a shrinking pie with the larger share funded by debt. Instead, increase the pie. And that's the approach that's being taken by the BRICS countries, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the nations of the Global South, and especially led by Russia and China. And that, of course, explains why Russia and China are the target of especially the City of London and Wall Street. So the question then is, how do you rebuild manufacture in the United States? And the problem is when you have governments controlled by the private banks with a focus on financial, insurance, and real estate as the basis for profit, then you're not going to have the ability to generate credit for large-scale industrialization, for upgrading small and medium manufacture, and so on. So the neoliberal economic model focuses on monetary profit. And instead, we have to junk that system and go back to a physical economic system, characteristic of the Hamiltonian credit system, which allowed the United States to become the world's greatest economic power in the first place. Now, when we talk about the speculative system, we're talking about the too big to fail banking system, that mega banks today are 40% larger than before the 2008 crisis. So the shift that's needed, of which tariffs are an element, but the shift is to a credit system, Hamiltonian credit system, not the Federal Reserve. And in fact, we should be looking to phase out the Federal Reserve completely. We need credit for manufacture, credit for infrastructure, credit especially in areas of science and technology, which are the source of productivity gains. So a reorganization is necessary. Now, not the reorganization of the World Economic Forum, of Mark Carney, of the so-called Great Reset, in which global corporations and technocrats take over economic policy from national sovereign governments, but instead a policy of a new development architecture with cooperation for mutual benefit. That's what we have been proposing from the LaRouche organization. And that means government credit is not there for the purpose of bailing out speculators, the too big to fail banks, these speculators who are losing money, to keep them in business, to cover corporate debt when the corporations are not making enough profit to cover their debt. No, instead you need investment to build up the physical economy again. Now, a part of this tariff policy is to allow for a large tax cut. But the last time we had a tax cut under President Trump, the corporations took the money from the tax cut to buy their own stocks. In other words, to increase speculation, or in some cases, just to cover their bad debt. Instead, we need a net increase in investment in real economic production. Now, that includes, as I said, to producers, including small and medium enterprises, which very often are the driver of technological progress. So where it's needed, there should be bankruptcy reorganization or even debt forgiveness, rather than keeping the volume of debt on the books of the banks and corporations, requiring bailouts to keep them in business. In other words, a liquidity policy as opposed to a policy of solvency. The move to a LaRouche policy of his 4 laws, and I'm appending in the description section his statement from 2014 on his 4 laws. That's the approach that's required today. Now, tariffs are a tool that can be used, and that was known to Hamilton and the Founding Fathers. But to protect those industries which are being subject to being undercut by other countries trying to undermine advance. And that's not only for the United States. Tariffs could be used by other countries that are being targeted. So that's what the 4 laws represent: a return to a system of physical economic growth, as opposed to tinkering around with monetary policy for the sake of bailing out the biggest speculators. And unfortunately, some of the people designing President Trump's policy are representatives of those speculators. So this is where you have to start when you're evaluating economic policy. I'm including 2 articles from the Executive Intelligence Review online by my associate Paul Gallagher, titled America Needs Credit. And these will help guide you to figure out what the fight is really all about. So thanks for joining me today. Be sure to join our publications. You can sign up for the Executive Intelligence Review to get our daily update, as well as our weekly online journal, the Executive Intelligence Review. So take advantage of it. Be part of the solution.